The night the aircraft descended toward Philippine airspace, no one on the ground knew that history was quietly rearranging itself. From the cockpit windows, the islands below looked calm, scattered like sleeping lights on dark water. Inside the plane, however, the mood was heavy, tense, and deeply personal. This was not a scheduled stop. This was not diplomacy as usual. This was an emergency landing that carried with it a debt nearly 50 years old. A debt not written in contracts or bank ledgers, but in memory, gratitude, and unfinished promises. Decades earlier, long before this moment, there lived a Filipino man whose life was ordinary by every standard. He was not a politician. He was not wealthy. He was simply a man trying to survive, working far from home, carrying his country in his accent and his work ethic. Fate carried him to Saudi Arabia in the early years of the kingdom's modern transformation. Like many Filipinos, he took jobs others refused, working long hours under the desert sun, sending what little he earned back home to family who depended on him. One day, everything changed. While working near a royal convoy, chaos erupted. A sudden medical emergency struck a young Saudi royal. Panic spread. Security froze. Time slowed to seconds that felt like years. Doctors were not nearby. The situation was desperate. And in that moment, the Filipino worker did something that would echo across generations. He stepped forward. He used skills learned from years of hardship and quick thinking. He acted not because he expected reward, but because a human life was at stake. That intervention saved the royal's life. In the days that followed, the palace took notice. The man was summoned, questioned, thanked. Offers were made. Money, protection, relocation. But the Filipino refused most of it. He accepted only what he needed to survive and asked for one thing in return: help for his family and dignity for workers like him. The king of Saudi Arabia at the time made a quiet promise. A promise not recorded in headlines. A promise sealed not with ink, but with honor. Years passed. The Filipino returned home. Life moved on, as life always does. Children were born. Stories were told and retold, sometimes doubted, sometimes dismissed as exaggeration. But one thing remained true. The Saudi royal family never forgot. Fast forward nearly 50 years. The Filipino man had grown old. His hair turned gray. His hands bore the marks of decades of labor. His children were now parents themselves. One of them carried the story like a fragile heirloom, unsure whether the world still cared about promises made so long ago. Then, one day, without warning, an official message arrived. The Saudi king was traveling. A private jet would make an unscheduled stop in the Philippines. Not for politics, not for ceremony, but for closure. When the aircraft requested emergency landing clearance, authorities were confused. There was no public health crisis, no mechanical failure that required immediate attention. Yet the landing was urgent, quiet, controlled. The king insisted. As the plane touched down, word spread quickly among airport staff. Security tightened. Whispers grew louder. Why would a Saudi king land here, now, unannounced? The answer was waiting in a modest home hundreds of kilometers away. When the royal convoy arrived, neighbors watched in disbelief. Expensive cars on narrow streets. Armed guards beside rusted gates. A king stepping out not to command, but to bow his head. Inside the house sat the old Filipino man, frail but alert, eyes sharp with memory. The moment they saw each other, time collapsed. No translators were needed at first. They looked at one another and understood. The king approached slowly, removed his head covering, and knelt, not as a ruler, as a man repaying a debt. Tears filled the room, not staged, not scripted. This was not the cold efficiency of power. This was human. The king spoke of that day long ago, of the fear, of the hand that reached out when no one else moved, of the promise he made and carried through decades of leadership. He apologized for the delay. He thanked him again. Then he fulfilled the promise. The family was granted lifelong support, education funds for grandchildren, medical care, homes repaired and rebuilt, scholarships created in the man's name, not just for his bloodline, but for Filipino workers across regions who reminded the king of the courage he once witnessed. But the most powerful gift was not material. It was recognition. In a world where migrant workers are often invisible, this story forced people to look again. It reminded nations that dignity cannot be measured by passports or uniforms, that a single act of humanity can bind kings and laborers in the same moral space. News of the visit spread slowly at first, then exploded. Some doubted it, others tried to politicize it. But the family did not care. They had seen the truth with their own eyes. Before leaving, the king stood at the doorway and addressed the gathered community. He spoke of gratitude, of humility, of debts that do not expire with time. He said that power means nothing if it forgets who saved it. When the plane took off again, the sky looked the same. The world continued as usual. But something had shifted. The old man passed away not long after, peacefully, surrounded by family. At his funeral, a wreath arrived bearing no political seal, only a simple message: a life saved, a promise kept. Today, scholarships still carry his name. Workers still tell the story in break rooms and dormitories. Not as a fairy tale, but as proof that humanity can outlast hierarchy. This is not a story about wealth. It is not a story about royalty. It is a story about memory, about a king who refused to forget, about a Filipino worker who never asked for greatness, and about how one moment of courage can travel 50 years through time, cross oceans, force a plane to land, and remind the world that the most powerful currency has always been gratitude. If stories like this matter to you, if you believe humanity still deserves a spotlight in a noisy world, stay with this channel. Subscribe, share, and keep these stories alive, because the ones worth telling are the ones that remind us who we are.